My world hasn't been the same since my grandmother died. I remember one weekend, I think it was Saturday, I went to check my mailbox as usual. Coming out of my apartment in just a green robe, shorts and slippers, I shuffled down the stairs. The sun's rays beat brightly through the supposedly mica windows on the flights of stairs. The persistent smell of cigarettes in the entrance did not bother me and even invigorated me, since I myself was a big fan of smoking, for which I constantly scold myself, so my apartment smelled about the same. Yes, and for 3 years of living here this smell has become somehow familiar, and in combination with such a bright sun, it gave a certain comfort or something. People who have not lived in such houses are unlikely to understand this Khrushchev romance, if one can even put it that way, but yes, these are details. When I got downstairs, the first thing I did was insert the key with a homemade tag into the slightly rusted lock of the general mailbox. A metal door with a carelessly painted red number 25 creaked open, emitting an echo of a nasty clang that echoed around the side at that hour. At that moment I could not even think that in a few moments my life would turn upside down. The rusty inside of the mailbox contained a letter about the death of my grandmother. Throwing the key into the pocket of my dressing gown, I tore the envelope, evenly folded paper. Having unfolded it, I was stunned. It read, Shestakova Galina Yuryevna, turned 73 years old, died on June 8, 2016. Then I could not read a word. My legs buckled, my eyes dimmed. How? Why? Thoughts were spinning like a crazy carousel, causing an unpleasant heaviness in the stomach and nausea. The lines floated and the hands trembled. My former drowsiness and serene joy vanished in a moment, passing the baton of adrenaline intoxication and the ensuing detachment. On wadded legs I barely hobbled to my apartment and somehow got to the sofa. I read those terrible lines over and over again, foolishly hoping that it was just my imagination. I turned the envelope in my hands, literally boring the paper with my eyes, reading the address and the recipient. In vain. There could be no mistake. My data was clearly written in blue ink, and no matter how much I reread, nothing changed. Tears welled up in my eyes. In my throat, Zaprashilo. The whole world suddenly lost its colors, becoming somehow dull, and already become a cast iron head. Memories from childhood began to spin. Here we are going to bed with Grandma. She is reading a fairy tale to me. Faded moonlight peacefully pours through the closed blue curtains. A dim lamp with orange light illuminates part of her face, highlighting every wrinkle, but each of them was so dear, so tender. Grandmother's voice, soft and melodic, like a quiet music box, it lulled me to sleep, gave peace and tranquility. I wrap myself in a blanket that pleasantly tingles my body. But in the morning we go to the cowshed. On the wet path behind the house we move straight to it. It is still a little cold outside. The sun has just risen because of the forest, which stood in a light lilac haze. That rotten warm smell is already clearly felt. The creak of a wooden door, and I literally douse with warmth from the inside. Grandmother with deft movements begins to milk the cows in turn, and I, fascinated by this spectacle, stand and watch. I hear the singing of birds, the crunch of hay, the snorting and champing of cows, and all this against the background of the noise of the forest, which wakes up, gaining strength. Memories abruptly transfer me to the river. In it I ran to swim in the evenings. Dark brown water, like coffee without milk, is clearly visible to my eyes. Here is a thicket of reeds on the left. Here is a low wooden bathhouse on the right. Everything is as if in reality, even the raft that cracked and turned green from time to time, on which my grandmother went to wash, and he was here. I seemed to have lived my life anew. I saw the brightest moments of my meetings with my grandmother. I felt the smell of her pies, fresh milk again. I visited all the familiar places. I felt their smells again, which were so clearly deposited in my memory. An unexpected phone call pulled me out of sleep. I twitched nervously, opening my eyes sharply. The obsession vanished. In the gray darkness of waking up, finding the phone was not so easy. There was a strange and unpleasant ripple in his eyes. After wiping the tears from my cheeks and stretching, I picked up the phone and pressed accept call. At the other end, my mother's voice was trembling. Emotions again flooded over me. My eyes, already tired of crying, only pitifully squeezed out tiny drops, while on the other side of the phone my mother began to get hysterical. I tried to calm her down for an hour, and after 40 minutes it kind of happened to me. Sobbing and breathing heavily, she asked me to go to the village and say goodbye to my grandmother. I didn't object. Wishing each other good night, we ended the conversation, knowing full well that good night, what I have, what my mother does not foresee. I lay down again in the dim twilight on the sofa. My head was cracking. My body went limp. Tomorrow I'll go. The next day I woke up in the same killed and devastated state as I had the night before. It was overcast outside the window, as well as in my soul. After a quick breakfast of coffee sandwiches, I packed everything I needed for a 2-day trip, while making myself a few more sandwiches for the road, since the path was not close. Having loaded provisions into a sports bag, dressed and locked the apartment, I went down to the courtyard. There my arrow was waiting for me, an old but frisky Emerald 9, which my father had given me at one time. At first, this car was the subject of my adoration, so my friends and I sat all day long in the garage, sorting it into screws and equipping it in every possible way. The output turned out to be a real beauty and part-time racing car. We replaced the factory salon with a semi-leather, which was considered an unaffordable luxury in our circles. The same fate befell the pedals with the steering wheel, replaced by racing versions of them Sparco. The engine was also shoveled, as a result of which its power was increased by 40 horsepower. About discs, dynamics and an exhaust system, I think, it is not necessary to tell. It was impossible to do without these bells and whistles. I put my bag in the back seat and set off. The Arrow obediently started up and rolled across the dew-drenched yard, shining with its wet hood. Pebbles creaked under the tires. Having left the yard to the city, and from there to the highway, I directed the car towards the village. After 2 hours, the asphalt ended. It was replaced by a primer, which was simply replete with pits of all shapes and sizes. It seemed that this road was specially created in order to mangle the cars that drive along it. I was really scared for my car. I was afraid of losing my exhaust pipe and crumbling the shock absorbers into dust. Not only was the road already terrible, but also the night rain, apparently, eroded it even more, making it look like clay jelly. Somehow weaving 10 kilometers, I finally saw a rusty overgrown sign Borisovka at the fork. So I was on the right track. The car, entering the turn, roared and, skidding, raised sheaves of dirt. After driving a few hundred meters more, I finally reached my destination. The village has changed little since my childhood. The same houses, the same sheds in the same places. Even almost all people remained the same, except that they got older. I parked the Arrow at my grandmother's house, which was on the outskirts of the village. Stepping out of the car, I caught myself for a second in a strong sense of déjà vu. Everything around me reminded me of my childhood, the bathhouse, and that same river, the house itself and the path. For a short time, I again felt the warm July sun on my face and the joyful cries of my friends. But when I opened my eyes, I realized that these were just my fantasies. The reality still remained the same gray and dull. Without my grandmother, this place became empty, cold, alien. Without thinking twice, I decided to go into the yard. The gate, which had not been oiled and darkened for many years, still greeted me with a creak. However, the creak was no longer joyful, but monotonous, inanimate. I went up to the porch, in my heart sincerely hoping that my grandmother would come out to me right now, alive and well. He will hug me, as in childhood, take me to the table, pour milk, feed me and begin to tell various wonderful stories. Oh, if everything was like that. I was met by a dull, tarnished porch. The windows of the house were no less tarnished. It immediately became uncomfortable. From the once native place, the former warmth no longer emanated. I pushed the door. It gave way. Strange. Shouldn't it be closed? Out of curiosity, I took a step inside. The inside of the house was also devoid of color, just like the outside. Diffused white light filtered through the dusty windows. The rooms were sepulchral cold. The stove has not been heated for a long time. It was deserted. I began to go around room after room, the things and interior of which inspired me with memories of those distant carefree days when, as a boy, I frolicked in these places. Dreaming, I did not notice how I sat on my grandmother's bed. And as soon as I touched the covered bedspread, I felt like an electric shock. It was as if a noose had been tightened around the neck. A wild suffocation shackled my whole body. The eyes began to darken. I tried to get up, but it was as if 5 bags of cement had been hung around my neck and shoulders. Out of desperation, I began to scream, but instead of a scream, a stifled hissing escaped. Somehow I managed to get off this ill-fated bed. I fell to the floor with a terrible shortness of breath. Rising to numb legs, I rushed headlong out of this house, screaming without ceasing, breathing rapidly and coughing. In 2 leaps I found myself in the yard, almost falling off the porch into the mud. At that moment, 2 old women were walking along the road, chatting. When they saw me jumping out of an empty house, they squealed thief with one voice. The neighbors ran to their cries. Some even jumped out with pitchforks and shovels. All this brethren instantly surrounded me, menacingly asked who I was and what I was doing in the house of the deceased. I explained to them in a trembling voice that I was the grandson of Galina Yuryevna. The inhabitants immediately changed their anger to mercy, lowering the pitchforks and sticks that had been put up until that moment. Some of them took off their hats and handkerchiefs and pressed them to their chests. Women vying with each other began to express sympathy and condolences to me, crying and hugging, and the men stood silently with their heads bowed. Then they told me to follow them. We walked along the main village street, passing the house of the village head, then turned onto a path trampled down by the locals, and the farther we walked, the clearer it became to me where exactly they were leading me. About 200 meters away I could see a small cemetery. Coming close to the cemetery gates, two men opened them, letting me go ahead. I passed through the gate. Mud sloshed underfoot, making them sink. Behind me, whispers, sobs and crying were heard. My gaze involuntarily fell on the grave on the left. It was relatively fresh. This was indicated by the rather dark earth and the footprints around it, which were filled with rainwater. I, trembling all over, approached the grave. From the portrait on the wet stone, my grandmother looked at me with a warm look and smiled. Everything inside me shrank. Tears welled up in my eyes. A choked whistle escaped from my chest, turning into a sob. I sat next to me right in the mud, hugging the tombstone with shaking hands. The villagers all this time stood at a distance and also cried. Clutching the earth in my hands, I begged my grandmother to return to me. I appealed for justice, but the only answer I got was the rustle of leaves and the sound of dripping raindrops. About an hour later, exhausted, dirty, shaking, I was carried into the house. There I asked them to leave me. No one argued. Everyone left, leaving me alone with grief, silence and despair. Having found the strength in myself only to change clothes, I lay back on the sofa, where they kindly laid me down. Tired and overstrained consciousness made it clear that I didn't have long to stay awake, and as soon as I thought about it, I immediately fell into an uneasy sleep. A roll of thunder pulled me out of sleep. Startled, I tried to compose myself. Apparently, a severe thunderstorm has begun. The rain was already pounding on the roof and windows. I was lying with my eyes closed. My head was spinning a bit. My consciousness was still somewhere far away. Ooh. There was a short sound from the next room. What? Exclamation mark. What is this? Exclamation mark. I immediately woke up and began to listen intently. Breathing and heartbeat quickened, and my head throbbed, as if it had been hit with a hammer. I tried to convince myself that it seemed to me awake, that it's just a stupid imagination. I continued to listen, but could not distinguish anything except ringing in my ears and the sound of rain. A few minutes of deathly silence nevertheless convinced me that it was just a game of my inflamed imagination. I closed my eyes again. Oh, I heard the sound coming from the bedroom, my grandmother's bedroom. I jumped. My heart began to beat at a frantic speed, intending to burst out of my chest. This time it definitely didn't seem to me. Exclamation mark. Thoughts flew one after another and did not want to be ordered in any way. Chew. The creak of springs. Like on a grandmother's bed. In my head, as luck would have it, I immediately remembered the incident of the previous day. This can't be. What's going on there?